On the 26th of October 1946, one of the most evil Nazi war criminals was brought to his execution in front of crowds of his former victims. Throughout the Second World War, the Nazis would set up many different concentration camps across the lands that they occupied and seized control of. The SS would operate these camps and would be responsible for the slaughter of millions there, and concentration camps varied in their sizes. The largest was Auschwitz, which saw over 1 million people killed inside of, but there were many other camps where a small number were housed, but these were still greatly feared and were very deadly. The civilians inside of the occupied lands were terrorised with executions being carried out in public, and this happened inside of the Czech Republic. Organisations such as the SD and Gestapo terrorised the people of Czechoslovakia, and in a town called Terezin, there was a large prison set up, and inside of here evil took place. The Small Fortress, as it was known, was a Gestapo prison, and there were many executions carried out there, overseen by the SS Commandant Heinrich Jockel. But he too would be executed at the end of the war. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Commandant of Terezin, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Heinrich Jockel was born on the 10th of July 1898, and he had a normal schooling and upbringing before he worked at the age of 15 as a farm worker. He was then ordered to join the German army as the First World War erupted around Europe, and after a few years on the battlefield he then went to work back in the fields. Following the First World War, many people in Germany turned towards more extreme political parties, and Hitler and the Nazis would promise people food, bread and disposable income, at a time where hyperinflation caused chaos and people were starving. Heinrich Jockel joined the Nazi Party in 1931, and he then 2 years later joined the SS. But inside of the SS he was very well thought of, and he was promoted a number of times before he became a Hauptsturmführer in 1938. Jockel most probably worked inside of a concentration camp, and it's believed he gained experience inside of camps such as Dachau which had been set up, and that during the Second World War he was not explicitly involved in the military and did not really have a combat role. But he would then work inside different concentration camps which were set up inside occupied lands. The Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, and they rampaged through the Czech lands, and they set up the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Inside this land, the Nazis established many different camps. They would also set up a number of different prisons, and Jockel was sent there as a commandant of an Orpo detachment. His control led to 2 different labour camps being set up, and in 1939 he was then established as a camp commander of the Shrokowitz concentration camp. This was part of a number of forced labour sites set up in the Sudetenland, and this camp that Jockel oversaw was part of a former sugar refinery. These camps were built for slave labour, and they had permanent German officers who worked there. But following ruling over the small camp for some time, Heinrich Jockel was then transferred to go and work inside of the Gestapo prison, which was known as the Small Fortress of Theresienstadt in June 1940. This was a site run by the secret police, and the Small Fortress had been open for a long time before it was transferred to become a Nazi work camp that they called Terezin. It was where the man who shot Franz Ferdinand that was the trigger for the First World War was imprisoned, and Gavrilo Princip died there. But mostly Czech prisoners were kept there, and the Nazis needed to use the small prison, as other sites quickly became full with large-scale arrests of resistance members. But many who helped the resistance and committed acts against the Nazis, as well as Jews who had broken anti-Semitic policies established by the occupiers, were held in Jockel's prison. But one of the most shocking events that took place in the area was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi official who was known as the Butcher of Prague. He was Heinrich Himmler's number 2, and he oversaw the lands, and following his death thousands of people were arrested and were then sent to the Small Fortress. The camp Jockel oversaw was divided into different areas. The first courtyard was for men, and roll call occurred there twice a day, and prisoners were divided between nationality. 90 people were kept in a barrack building, and they had to sleep on wooden planks 3 stories high, and there was only one sink and toilet. Water had to be reused, meaning disease was rife, and prisoners were banned from using light, meaning that the barracks were kept in complete darkness most of the time, and there was no heating, and prisoners suffered from lice. The second courtyard was for administration, and the transports then arrived in there, and it took hours for prisoners to be admitted to the Small Fortress, and the inmates on arrival handed over their belongings. Prisoners were forced to wear old Czech uniforms, and women kept their civilian clothes, but men were also shaved bald. The fortress became a sight which was horrific, and those Jews who had escaped from the nearby ghettos or who had collaborated with the resistance were sent there for punishment. They would be tortured and murdered inside of the prison, and the Jewish cells were even worse as they had no toilet or fresh air. From one courtyard, prisoners were forced to watch executions each day, and these specific barracks held 600 people who slept on floors, and disease was everywhere with typhus killing hundreds. Heinrich Jockel personally oversaw the punishment at Terezin, and there were 20 solitary confinement cells where torture took place. There was also a small infirmary set up, and Jewish and Russian prisoners were not allowed to receive any medical treatment, and Jockel would order this himself. He regularly ordered that people should not be given treatment leading to more death, and one of the worst parts of his camp was known as the Gate of Death. This would open up to the courtyard where executions and shootings would take place. This was a former firing range, and execution was common here, and most were executed by being shot. Jockel would also assign the most difficult work to Jewish prisoners, and many died from overworking, but despite being known for being a brute, he lived in the camp with his own family, and almost lived a double life. But as the Second World War went against the Germans, Jockel ordered 53 prisoners to be executed, and these were shot as he was trying to flee Sercienstadt. He fled 3 days before the Red Army seized the small fortress and liberated, and Jockel was a wanted man who was now on the run, and he ordered his family back with him to Germany. He returned to his hometown, and within weeks of being on the run the Americans found him, and he was then arrested. Jockel was arrested and he was then handed back to the Czechs, and was sent to stand trial. He was imprisoned at the former camp that he oversaw, and was kept in the cells for the Jews, which were very cramped and terrible, but for one man they weren't too bad. His wife and eldest daughter was also imprisoned at the small fortress, and eventually Jockel was placed on trial in a courtroom in Litoměřice. Heinrich Jockel was then sentenced to death, and the court heard from many witnesses who told the evil mistreatment of prisoners at the small fortress. The courtroom heard how Jockel had ordered hundreds of executions, and because of his crimes he was then sentenced to death. Near to the very camp that he was a commandant of, Heinrich Jockel was brought to a small execution site for his death. It was actually a stake where he was hanged, as the Czechs did not use the long drop method, but they instead used the pole hanging method. Heinrich Jockel, on the 26th of October 1946, was brought into a courtyard, where the stake was for his execution and was being prepared, and stood by it was an executioner. A large number of people, including Czech army soldiers, were there to witness the execution, and many other former prisoners of his camp were there to see justice. Jockel was then brought into the courtyard, and he was led up the steps to a wooden platform. Whilst here the executioner secured his waist to the wooden post with a belt, and then tied his legs together with rope. A hook was on the post above his head, and he was then suspended off the ground. After final checks, the noose was placed over his head and around his neck, and then the platform underneath him was released, and the rope jerked, suspending him in the air, and his neck was then snapped. Jockel's execution was very quick and swift, and those who looked on saw the former commandant of Terezin Small Fortress hanging on the stake. Heinrich Jockel oversaw the camp with much horror and evil. There was not a gas chamber set up inside of his site, but there were execution sites such as gallows and firing ranges, where hundreds of people were executed. He forced thousands to watch the executions to keep people in a state of terror, and the conditions of the camp were terrible. But on a pole close to the camp that he oversaw, one of the most evil SS commanders was sentenced to death and was executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.